So, welcome everybody to tonight's seminar on Holocaust survivors and dementia. My name is Adina Siegel. I am the Jewish Community Outreach Social Worker at Caring Kind. And I will talk to you a bit more about what we do at Caring Kind a bit later, but this is actually, I think, for this year anyway, our first seminar of Jewish interest. So I hope that this will be something helpful for everybody. So for our agenda for today, we're going to go over what dementia is, just a general overview of the symptoms and the causes. We'll talk about special considerations for Holocaust survivors. We'll talk about specific things that caregivers can do when dealing with somebody who has dementia and is a Holocaust survivor. We'll look at the family dynamics that often come with survivor families and how that impacts the caregiving experience. We are going to talk about caring for the caregiver. As you will see, that's an incredibly important component of this whole presentation. If there's anything you come out with from this, it will be take care of yourself. And then there'll be some times for questions and answers. I'm also going to be going over some resources like that in the agenda, but that's going to be part of caring for the caregiver. So for understanding dementia, when we define dementia, dementia is actually not an illness in and of itself. It's a group of symptoms that result from an underlying medical condition. The number one cause of dementia is Alzheimer's disease, certainly dementia that can't be reversed. And when we're talking about what dementia is, so it's these groups of symptoms affect 4 different areas of functioning. The most common one that I think most people know if you ask them on the street is memory. It starts out with difficulties with short-term memory, later on affecting long-term memories. It also affects cognition, which people may or may not realize when they're talking about dementia, where it involves thinking, planning, reasoning, using logic. That all gets negatively impacted. It can affect mood and personality. You can have major personality changes in a person where a person might be a really nice person and then suddenly they really change and get really nasty. It can also happen in the reverse, where somebody who's really nasty suddenly becomes really nice and sweet, which adds a whole different layer of complexity to this illness. But even if there aren't major personality changes, a lot of times you will see a lot of agitation and anger and things like that, which I'll discuss more at length in my next slides. And the last thing that it affects, and when you think about it, if it's a brain disease, it makes sense, is it affects physical functioning, particularly in the later stages. You'll see problems with motor skills, with fine motor skills, being able to button, being able to use cutlery, gait, balance, all of those things get affected. And so the disease has stages. There are a couple of different ways of staging the disease. This is the way we stage it at Caring Kind. Mild cognitive impairment is not necessarily a stage of Alzheimer's. It's more of like a preclinical stage. And that's where you will have significant memory impairment, which is noticeable by others, but it's not severe enough to interfere with independence. So, you do see this sometimes with older adults where, they're really forgetful. They may have to write everything down. They may not remember somebody they met yesterday, but they can shop for themselves, cook for themselves, clean for themselves. They're basically taking care of their personal care. They're basically functional. It's just that their memory is really bad. A lot of time, in some cases, it actually can stay at mild cognitive impairment and a person does not go on to develop full-blown Alzheimer's disease. But in the majority of cases, it goes on to develop into Alzheimer's disease. So once you hit Alzheimer's disease, then we have the early stage, the middle stage, and the late stage. The early stage can last anywhere from 1 to 5 years. The middle stage can last anywhere from 2 to 10 years. The late stage can last anywhere from 1 to 7 years, which is a huge variability. It can be a 5-year course of the disease to a 20-year course of the disease, which looks very different for different families. So I always tell people, if you see one person with Alzheimer's, you're seeing one person with Alzheimer's. You can't extrapolate their experience to what will happen to the experience of the person you know. But in the early stage, you'll see more short-term memory loss. You'll see difficulties managing finances. That's often the number one reason why families will realize that there is a problem and that they have to get help. You'll see increasingly poor judgment, difficulty performing regular tasks. They might not be able to go shopping. They might not be taking care of themselves in terms of hygiene or in terms of changing clothing or things like that. It's more, their functioning is definitely more impacted. They can still be pretty independent. They might need some help. I'll often tell people this is the time to, if somebody can please mute their, I don't know who that is, please mute. If somebody, not somebody, at this stage, you know, they might, it's helpful to have some help. I tell people to start with, kind of start getting help now so that it's not such a shock in the later stages, because going from 0 to 12 hours is very difficult. And so for people, and it's a big adjustment. And so that is what I will often tell people. But you know, overall, a person can still live relatively independently in the early stage. Once they hit the middle stage, you have much more communication difficulties. There may be a lot of difficulty following a conversation. There may be difficulty finishing a sentence. So, you know, the communication is very impaired. And of course, if somebody can't communicate how they're feeling, the feelings don't go away. They will express those feelings in other ways, which usually translates to difficult behaviors that we commonly see. So you'll see mood swings, you'll see anger, agitation. A lot of times this is sundowning starts developing at this stage where it's, you know, towards the middle to the end of the day, it might be agitated, they might have delusions or hallucinations. You know, they're going to have more difficulty with personal care, difficulties with incontinence. Wandering happens at this stage. And so that's kind of where, you know, I guess, you know, things are quite difficult. And then the late stage is, as I mentioned, 1 to 7 years. There's very limited verbal ability. I mean, in the middle stage, there might be some. In the late stage, usually it's limited to maybe some phrases that may or may not have meaning. They're not really using language in a meaningful way. It might be more of a repetitive kind of thing. Person becomes completely bedbound, and they're really completely dependent on other people for all aspects of personal care. Limited recognition of self and others, so they may not even recognize themselves in the mirror. At this stage, it's often the case that the safest place to be is in a nursing home. There are families who, you know, really have the resources and are able to care for a person at home. But given the intense physical needs, it's often not always practical or safe for the person to be home. In the middle stage, that's usually, I forgot to mention this, but in the middle stage, that's usually where a person starts needing 12 to 24 hours of home care just to stay home safely. I wanted to mention that. And then caregivers tend to find these behaviors challenging at the various stages. So early stage, I mentioned difficulty with money, medication management is not usually happening, difficulty with hygiene, showering, and eating. That's not to say that this stops at, you know, once they hit the middle stage. Once you have the middle stage, you have a lot more of wandering behaviors, of sundowning and hallucinations, paranoia, even more disorientation to time and place. In the early stage, you might have some disorientation to time and place. They might get lost in familiar places. In the middle stage, you know, they may not really realize what the season is or what year it is, those sorts of things, and have a difficult time recognizing family members. By the end stage, there's usually feeding difficulties. This is where those physical processes get impacted more. So you'll have difficulties with swallowing because the swallowing reflex, part of the brain that controls the swallowing reflex gets affected. So they're going to be dependent on others for all activities of daily living. So in terms of changing, in terms of even just transferring from bed to chair, they're going to need help with all of that. And as caregivers, the main concern at this stage is usually around their comfort over really above anything else, because that's really where they're at. So when it comes to Holocaust survivors, here are some considerations. Is that in general, not even just with dementia, aging can be particularly difficult for Holocaust survivors. When we think about just what they've had to do to survive, they have always had to be in good physical condition and being able to be in control of everything. And aging is sort of where control, people lose control over things. There just isn't as much control that people have over their lives. So particularly with retirement or unstructured time, before there was a structure, there was a purpose, they knew what they had to do. Once you hit retirement, a lot of times the PTSD symptoms that they might have been able to control are now, not as well controlled, and there may be an emergence of those symptoms. And one thing I want to also say, I see this a lot in families of Holocaust survivors where there's a lot of resistance, or there can be a lot of resistance to care, a lot of resistance to going to the doctor, refusing to go to the doctor, refusing to bring in a home health. They just refusing to acknowledge these difficulties. It can be very, very difficult for the caregiver because they usually have to deal with the fallout, which does certainly have consequences. But that is often something, and what I try to frame it for them while providing the support that they need is that, this is what your parent was doing to survive, and they just can't let go of that because of their past. It can be helpful to frame it that way. It doesn't necessarily practically change much, but at least for the caregiver, it can be at least a little demystifying. Another thing to keep in mind, though, about the PTSD symptoms is that PTSD, there have been studies showing that PTSD can actually impact cognitive impairment and cause premature brain aging. And on the flip side, a person who is cognitively impaired, due to that impairment, actually the traumatic memories that were previously suppressed may come out stronger because all of the coping mechanisms that they had are now kind of leaving and not as strong or not even remembered. So it can be difficult because in both ways, in terms of the PTSD can I don't know about directly causing, but can be a cause of the cognitive impairment or pushing it. And then on top of that, because of the dementia, you may see more traumatic memories that come up. So one thing or a very important thing to keep in mind with Holocaust survivors is that, what's interesting is, a lot of times their symptoms look the same. Their symptoms really can look the same as somebody who is not a Holocaust survivor, somebody who does not have PTSD. A person without PTSD can still be paranoid, can still have hallucinations, can still, do some strange behaviors. The difference is with people who have trauma in their background, particularly Holocaust survivors, is that their symptoms have meaning, and that actually will change the way that they can and should be addressed. So, as I mentioned, the resistance to care, not unusual in non-Holocaust survivors either. I definitely deal with families who have to deal with that. The resistance to care has a different meaning for Holocaust survivors. Preoccupations with food is obviously going to have a very different meaning for somebody with Holocaust survivors. Hoarding food, hoarding stuff. I mean, these people, everything was taken away from them. Of course, they are going to, or if they're putting stuff in all sorts of places, what's going on in their mind might be related to something that happened in their past. You may see more resistance to having a homemade, also to long-term care facility rules. Nursing home placement can be very difficult for people, for Holocaust survivors, because it's an institution and they have been through institutions, and it can be very triggering. And they can, you know, the re-experiencing of their traumatic memories and flashbacks and hallucinations can trigger that anger and paranoia. So it's not just that they're having a hallucination because they have dementia. It may be a full-on PTSD hallucination of something that actually happened. And that will increase their anger and paranoia. They may show separation anxiety when family members leave. And it's not necessarily because of, in a general dementia patient, you know, patient without that background, they are losing the capacity to understand that the person may come back. This in a Holocaust survivor, that separation anxiety is maybe coming about because, well, when people left, they actually died or they were taken away and they were never seen again. So there's a certain element of reality to that person's situation. They also may bring up murdered family members around holiday times and celebrations, which, you know, can be distressing to caregivers or even distressing to themselves if they have a bad memory with it. And some common triggers that may cause some behaviors that are difficult, are all things that can relate to the Holocaust experience. So bathing is, you know, I guess that's kind of self-evident. Bathing is usually a precursor to gas chambers. So that was obviously, you know, very traumatic. Any sort of ambulance or police sirens can be traumatizing. Loud announcements or crying and screaming, particularly in nursing homes, can be triggering. Dogs are often a trigger. Uniforms, high black boots, striped clothing, foreign accents. Also, you know, when you know, in the Holocaust survivor experience, they were not always the people who spoke the same way that they spoke. So, and in care, we all know that people have different accents that might be triggering for them. Strong bathroom odors can be very triggering. That was also very common in the camps. Haircuts, doctors, I mentioned resistance to care. Oftentimes, if you were sick, that meant that, you know, you were going to die or they were going to kill you. So a lot of time, you know, you had to make sure that you were not sick or that you could, you know, show a stance of health. So same thing here, you know, except that it's, you know, obviously not that time. A Holocaust survivor may have difficulty or show that resistance to going to the doctor because, well, if you went to the doctor, that meant that you were earmarked for killing. And night is, you know, the worst things that happened were at night. So these are all things to keep in mind. So what caregivers can do. So when it comes to handling challenging behaviors, and I often get this a lot, you know, do you let the person, you know, go with the whatever, you know, is in their head that may not be accurate? Do you correct them? So, you know, at Care and Kind, what we will advise people all the time is unless it has to relate to the person's personal health and safety, you know, really just roll with everything that is possible. You know, I have a great example that it's not mine, but I heard it in a presentation on Holocaust survivors with dementia from a while back. And they were talking about a man, this was in a nursing home, who insisted on keeping his boots with him at all times, including in his bed. And as you know, in nursing homes, obviously that's not a great thing. It's a wonderful way of spreading germs. But this was a nursing home that was trauma informed, and they actually let him keep his boots with him even when he was sleeping. You know, that's like an example of you know, something that can be done that, you know, can make the person feel at ease. You don't, it's not force them to do something against their will. You want to, and that's really what the goal is. The second point, you want to do your best to assist the person with dementia in feeling safe. And what's really important to do that is making sure that they feel heard. So if they say something that really doesn't make sense, I mean, this is the general one that I'm thinking of is usually done, like, let's say if there's a delusion, a spouse sometimes will have a delusion that their spouse is having an affair on them. You know, the best way or it's a difficult thing to handle, but one of the ways that it can be handled is to acknowledge that they said that, you know, you think I'm having an affair, just to have them know that you heard them. And then you can go on to say, not, no, I didn't, but I love you. Why would I do that? Or something more emotionally responsive. But whatever the case may be, you really, if the person says they want to go home, it's important to acknowledge you really want to go home. Another thing to keep in mind, especially if they're experiencing a flashback, if they're thinking they're in the camps, and that can be very disorienting to the caregiver who may not even know the person's story, because a lot of times, as I'll mention later, it's not really talked about. You can join them in the experience. Well, what can we do to best protect ourselves? And the person will have, may be able to have some sort of idea of what they would feel would be safe in that moment. The most important thing, though, is not to force them to do things against their will, to see what alternatives can be utilized to get the tasks done. So if they don't want to shower, don't force them in the shower. Maybe they can be sponge bathed. Maybe, giving them a handheld shower will give them more of a sense of control. But you really do not want to force them to do things against their will, because that will exacerbate the anger and agitation. So other things not really related to behaviors, but really important caregiver things that I want to mention, and this is really for all caregivers, honestly, the importance of advanced directives. I really can't emphasize this enough, and I think particularly in survivor families, it's important, and they're the ones who are least likely to do them, because of, talking about it can be so difficult. But the advanced directives, such as healthcare proxies, power of attorneys, living wills, if they're Orthodox, halachic living will, are really important because it gives them the control that they have over their care. And really, without those documents, they are actually left more to on-the-fly decisions, based that are crisis-based, more than things that can be planned out and that can actually you can actually have more control over. So it is really important for families to have these discussions and try to get these documents signed as best they can. Other things to consider, even just in terms of helping the person with their functioning, especially in the early to even some somewhat middle stages, are using assistive devices. So, large calendars, big clocks, or talking clocks. A lot of people now are using smart home devices, which are pretty amazing what they can do. I mean, in terms of even just maintaining the home, making sure that the door is locked, making sure that the lights are on or off, being able to get medication reminders through the device. I'm talking about devices like Alexa or what they call Google Home, or those sorts of devices. There are all sorts of products on the market, and they can be very helpful, and they can actually help a person retain their functioning longer. Electronic pill boxes are another. There are a whole lot of electronic pill boxes that some of them come with special blister packs to help with medication management, and these are all things that can, again, foster independence. And the last thing is getting home care is really, really important. It's important for caregivers to have a break. If they're the primary caregiver. If they're not the primary caregiver, then obviously you want to maintain the person's safety. If they're living alone, so also really, really important. One thing that I think, at least in this population, that they're fortunate about is that there are for many survivors, they are eligible to get home care through the claims conference. Another really wonderful thing, and we're quite grateful to the United States for this, is anything that a person gets through the claims conference is not counted towards Medicaid. So when they're looking at Medicaid eligibility, let's say they're also applying for Medicaid, whatever they're, or in terms of income, or in terms of home care or whatever, that's not even that. So it's a really, really helpful thing. So now for family dynamics and the caregiving experience. So in families, there are a lot of, I have to say, and I don't think you can necessarily extrapolate to all families. There's always difference in families. These are things that have been found in the literature. With spouses, even with spouses who are not survivors, who have married a survivor, there have been found to be high levels of secondary trauma. And what has also been found is that children in two survivor families tend to have higher levels of intergenerational trauma than either one survivor families or no survivor families. And when it comes to caregiving, depending on how the trauma has been seen by the family, it will impact the way the caregiving is done. So if the surviving parent was seen, with compassion for their trauma, then it'll be easier for that family to care for the survivor parent. If that trauma was seen as a major burden, it's going to be a lot harder for the caregivers in the family to be able to do what they need to do and for them to deal with it emotionally. In terms of children, so one thing that I think is very well documented in childhood survivors is this idea of parentification. There's a lot of emotional enmeshment. That the child, often felt the need to compensate for the pain that the parent went through, and so you had the children who were just trying to constantly be perfect, to not show any anger or anything that might hurt the parent. And a lot of time, even a lot of them may have trouble individuating, moving on, and being able to have a separate sense of self, because sometimes their parents would find that so threatening. So we do see a lot of that, and that most definitely impacts the caregiving experience when it comes to getting help, when it comes to if somebody does need to be in a facility. It can trigger a lot of emotion in people and a lot of difficulties for people to come to terms with. I also want to talk about the double wall of shame, which is a point coined by Schmutkin, where he describes the dynamic where the survivor parent doesn't want to speak about their traumas. They don't want to scare their children. And in turn, the children don't ask because they don't want to cause their parents more pain. The ironic thing with this is that it actually makes the trauma bigger, because the children can conjure up all sorts of things that, maybe even worse than what happened. So it actually can kind of compound things. What's interesting as the survivor ages, there's actually oftentimes more of a willingness to speak about their experiences and get some closure from their past, which we've definitely seen. Even just in the media, in the 50s and 60s, survivors really didn't speak much, certainly publicly, about their experiences. And then, once, even a bit before Schindler's List, but you had these initiatives to have people talking about and give testimony about what happened to them. So we do see this reflected in the general public, but it also happens within families, and this makes sense because at this stage in life, in the older age stage, that's when a person goes through what's called life review. They're trying to make sense of what happened to them, of their life, of how things happen. So a lot of times a survivor might be more willing to talk about what happened to them later in life. With dementia, this sort of life review and this sort of trying to come to some sort of a terms or understanding of what happened to them doesn't happen because they don't have the capacity to do it. The thing is, because even with that, they're still perhaps showing these signs of trauma because these memories are coming up, and it actually becomes more burdensome for the caregiver because they sort of have to shoulder this traumatic content that's coming up due to the dementia. They don't know, they may or may not know the story. They probably don't, or don't know all the story, and it can make things much harder. Another thing to keep in mind when we talk about this is that grandchildren have often been the buffer for survivors between them and their children, and survivors are often more willing to speak to their grandchildren about what happened to them. And this is actually good because there's that intergenerational distance, and also you have the parents, who are sort of in between and can modulate the traumatic content so that if it gets too much, they can kind of manage it. It's actually been found that if the parents don't manage it, then it actually may not necessarily be great for the grandchildren. But if you have a family on board where you have that dynamic, that it actually can be very good. I'd also like to say grandchildren a lot of times can be a resource when it comes to dementia as well. A lot of grandparents will do anything for their grandchildren, and we'll often give guidance to see if there is a willing grandchild to get involved, it can be very helpful. I'll give an example. We have a wanderer safety program, which is through Medical Alert. It's a basic bracelet made of titanium, and it's on the inside of it is engraved cognitive impairment, and it has a tracking number and Medical Alert's number. And it's great because if somebody is wandering and they're found, they can be reunited with the family much quicker than if they didn't have that. We have studies on that. What's interesting is a lot of times people with dementia in general, and survivors, don't really want to wear it, right? I mean, who wants to wear this Medical Alert bracelet? It shows there's something wrong with me. And one of the ways, we have a couple of ways to try to cajole people to do it, but is to see if the grandchild can give it as a gift. And a lot of times, the grandparent isn't going to want to say no to their grandchild. So that often can work. And in other ways, a grandparent might listen to a grandchild over their child. So it's just another thing to think about. So in terms of the caregiving experience, so I found the term filial piety, which is this, I guess, the sciencey term, about the sense of obligation that a person feels towards caregiving. And especially in Holocaust survivors, there's often a very high degree of this filial piety because it comes from that desire to protect the parent from pain. And it is not unusual to see, very involved children of Holocaust survivors in their care. What we also see is guilt and anxiety. A lot of children of survivors have a strong fear of their parent dying. They've often come to internalize this idea of their parents as being infallible. Like they can't be brought down, or they'll never die because they've already beaten death, and it can be a real insult or not an insult, but like a shock to the system to realize that their parents will die, as everybody does. So that can create a lot of feelings. That can also totally increase the anxiety because they have to do everything they can to make sure that the parent stays alive. Another thing that you see is guilt around complaining. So a lot of caregivers are going to minimize whatever burdens or feelings of burden that they feel, because it's like, well, it wasn't the camps. So, how can I complain about anything? And as a result, there's a lot of disinclination to reach out for help. They often don't. I don't need it. I don't want it. It's not such a big deal. A lot of minimizing of that. And what's interesting, what research has found is that this sense of filial piety actually affects these feelings of anxiety and guilt, meaning that the more one feels obligated, and I mean, it makes sense, the more one feels obligated to, protect the parent, care for the parent, make sure the parent's not dying, the higher their anxiety is going to be. I just had this experience with somebody very recently where they were also talking about this sense of, it was a parent who centenarian, and of doing everything they can to make sure that the parent stays alive, and they were definitely feeling lots of guilt and lots of anxiety around it. And finally I'm saying, you're doing everything you can, you're only human. And it was sort of like expressing that fact that they're human. They needed to hear it, and they're like, you know what, you're right, and they were able to calm down. But it's something to keep in mind that that sense of obligation is challenges. And I'll often say I give an understanding dementia workshop just on general dementia, and I'll tell people, all of your feelings are valid as a caregiver, and It's totally true. And we give a lot of space to the negative feelings because there are a lot of negative feelings. And I think what's important to also keep in mind is for many people, not for everybody, but for many people, there are some positive feelings also. So even though this filial piety can be burdensome, it can also be protective. There's this dichotomy of dedication versus obligation. Does the person feel dedicated to the parent or obligated to the parent? I also want to say that it's not either or. I mean, it can be protective in some ways, and it can also be a burden in other ways. So, but it's important to bear in mind that there is a totality of feelings when it comes to caring for a person with dementia, any person with dementia, and certainly survivors. And so I think that's important. Another thing that can come up for people, which also may be protective or may be a sense of pride, is that, Jewish tradition has a very strong sense of caring, of honoring parents and caring for parents. Being connected with that can help caregivers as well in terms of buffering from a lot of the stress. Even if it's not necessarily out of a religious obligation, there might be, real feelings of affection and respect for that person and wanting to give back. That can also be a buffer from that burden. And even the idea that they're protecting the survivor from pain can buffer from those negative feelings as well. I mean, also depends on the dedication versus obligation piece, and it sometimes can be both, but it's important to acknowledge those things as well. So what the caregiver can do for themselves. So most important, especially given that a lot of caregivers don't really want to reach out for help, or I don't want to say don't want to, but don't feel that they should reach out for help, is to encourage them to reach out for help. That there is help. Obviously, Care and Kind, we do provide support, emotional support for caregivers. Other Holocaust survivor programs can be very helpful. Joining support groups, either through Care and Kind. There are plenty of other organizations as well. Those are all really helpful. It's also important to focus on what you can control, right? I mean, with that client of mine who was concerned about doing everything she could to prevent her father from dying, she's doing everything she can. She needed the reminder that she was, but there are plenty of things that can't be controlled. Even with families where the parent is resistant to, say, going to the doctor or bringing a home health aide in, there's only so much that a caregiver can control. And a lot of times, that's where their focus can be. And after that, we kind of go back to the reaching out for help piece, because there's only so much that you can do and so much that they're willing to take, and whatever they aren't, we have support groups for that. It's really important to practice self-care. Caregivers are notorious for not practicing self-care. And when I'm talking about what I mean by self-care, it's not necessarily, going to a spa and, getting a massage. I'm talking about just basic things for the person's well-being. So I'm talking about eating regularly, I would dare say exercising regularly, or going out, being able to go to the doctor and get all your preventative, work done, being able to, if you are working, to be able to go to work and, have an income. Those are just some examples, but, taking time for yourself also. I mean, you can't always be on. When the pandemic was really raging in 2020, and caregivers really didn't have the care that in the home. There was also sorts of upheaval. We were trying to help people just, do what they could to care for themselves. And I would often tell people, listen, if you have to go to the bathroom and just stay there for 2 minutes with doing deep breathing, just do that. You need some sort of break, some way to replenish. And that is what I mean by self-care. As I mentioned, accepting all feelings, positive and the negative. What often happens if we fight negative feelings is that they get stronger. By allowing negative feelings to be, felt, surprisingly, they do pass. So, and realize that those feelings are all normal in this experience. Also really important to forgive yourself. We're all human. And cultivate patience with yourself and the person with dementia. This takes a lot of patience, and some people are more patient than others. And I guess this is also where forgiveness comes in and self-acceptance comes in. But realizing that you're doing the best that you can, and sort of just focusing on what you can control. It's all kind of going back together. So I want to take this time to talk a bit about Care in Kind and what we can do to help. And specifically, I do have resources at the very end of other things. So we have a helpline for caregivers. It provides information and referral. It's basically the gateway to all of our programs. So if you're interested in any of Care in Kind programs, you can contact our helpline. That's at 646-744-2900. We have social work services where we help with care planning. We help with emotional support, figuring out how to navigate various care situations, various home care situations, family situation that you might need some guidance on. These are all things that we can provide help with. I would say, if you are wondering if we do it, just call the helpline, and we probably. We have support groups. Our support groups are based in all 5 boroughs. Right now, they're all virtual, but they will hopefully eventually be back in all 5 boroughs. We also have support groups. I actually am running one right now, specifically for Orthodox adult children caregivers. So if anybody knows of anybody who's interested, they can certainly let me know. We have education and training similar to a program that we're having tonight. We have, as I mentioned, we have regular understanding dementia workshops, which run twice a month. It's pretty much Dementia 101. Highly recommended for any, as a precursor to any of our programs. We also have a legal and financial seminar, which goes through not just say the advanced directives, but also about Medicaid planning and things to know about that. It's facilitated by a lawyer, so you get all your legal questions answered. I do have to say, if anybody here is from out of New York State, it is New York State centric, so may not be helpful for everybody. But we do have monthly education meetings every month. I believe it's the second Monday of every month. This month is actually going to be Bathing Without a Battle. So if people want to do a deeper dive into showering and bathing issues, I highly recommend it. You can call our helpline or email to register for that. And we also have a family caregiver workshop, which is an even deeper dive into difficult behaviors. That is a 4-part workshop. It's 4 weeks. It's about 3 hours each time. And the focus is really on managing challenging behaviors, and also a really strong focus on self-care and how to take care of yourself in the process. I mentioned our Medical Alert Wanderer Safety Program. That is our bracelet that is with Medical Alert. Again, this is actually a New York City program. So if you're out of New York City, you can call us. We can direct you to the Medical Alert program in your area. But what is great about our program anyway is that if somebody has been found to wander, we do have social work follow-up as well, afterwards, to try to ensure that it won't happen again. And actually, what's really exciting now, we have more programs for people with dementia. So Connect to Culture is a program that we have, which connects to museums and other cultural institutions in New York City, and we provide dementia-friendly programming. A lot of our stuff is virtual, but it will start being in person again shortly, or we have some. It's going to be both. But if anybody's interested, you can feel free also to call the helpline. We're also going to be starting to have more Jewish-focused Connect to Culture events. So we're going to be doing some programs with the Eldridge Street Museum and with the Jewish Museum. So I'm really excited about that. And we are also we have an early stage program that will be coming up in the next few months, where we're doing cognitive stimulation therapy. or cognitive stimulation training, I should say, for people in the early to mid stage of dementia. So right now that's going to be virtual, but if anybody is interested, please call our helpline. You can get more information on it, and you can put the person on who might be interested on our waiting list. I also just want to point out, I know that we have a lot of healthcare providers in the audience, that this program is actually an initiative from our Jewish community outreach program. We are very dedicated to diversity and inclusion. We actually have programming available in Chinese, in Spanish, and also programming dedicated to African American interests. So also, if you're interested, please call our helpline, and we're happy to connect with you. Another thing, and I'm going to be sending this link actually as a follow-up, so you don't have to go nuts with this, but we actually did have a pamphlet which we produced on trauma and how it affects a person with dementia, and this one actually focuses on Holocaust survivors and combat veterans, and actually also survivors of abuse. Basically, anybody who has PTSD. While there are some differences, there are a lot of similarities in all of these populations. I would also, just as a caveat to this presentation, say that if you know there have been other genocides and other, major traumatic warlike events that people of, all sorts of countries and cultures have gone through. And I would say, I'm sure a lot of these dynamics can transfer over to, those populations as well. Just for those of us who are the healthcare providers, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And I have a couple of other resources just for you to know about. So what is probably one of the best kept secrets in this country is that as part of our aging services, caregiver support is one of those services that are required to be provided. So every district in this country has a caregiver support program. It's a general caregiver support program, but it support groups. It provides respite, among other things. So in New York, the local office is Department for the Aging. But if you are not from New York, or even if you want to get the number for Department for the Aging, you can use the Elder Care Locator, and that can get you that information. Also, the Holocaust Claims Conference has a listing of all of the survivor help centers that they have. They have a lot of community programs that provide socialization, that provide case management, some home care, all depending on, I guess the person's experience. So that's another important resource. I also have a link to the Baycrest Online Holocaust Survivor Manual. So Baycrest is actually I think it's a long-term care facility, and I think they have other programs as well, like, day programs. It's in Canada, and they published a manual, it's online, about how to support how aging Holocaust survivors. To be really wonderful. So I'll send you that info as well. I'm also including the Alzheimer's Association and the Alzheimer's Foundation for America, particularly, out of the boroughs. We try to help people as best we can, but sometimes, we don't know the lay of the land of places outside of New York City as well. So we'll direct you to the local chapter of the Alzheimer's Association. And the Alzheimer's Foundation of America also has great resources and other really interesting programs. So they have pet therapy. So you can take a look at them too. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And I will open it up to questions. I see that there are a lot of questions in the chat. So I'm going to look at that first, if that's okay. Is there a demographic of older Holocaust survivors in New York City? I don't know the number offhand. It is in the thousands. I don't know it for sure. I can look that up and get back to you. but I don't have that number off the top of my head. Okay, tips making making a positive experience, introducing a home health aide who is not Jewish and from the Caribbean to the survivor. So this is a very good question. Somebody is asking, what can be done when you have a survivor who is going to be introduced to an aide who is not Jewish and is Caribbean. I would say try to have the aide bring either a favorite food or engage with, maybe if she really likes doing a certain game, bring that with you. Try to engage her in things that the survivor really might enjoy or will. Let's put it this way: you want the survivor to associate positive things with you. And actually, I mean, it doesn't even just have to be a survivor, but in general, you want them to have that positive association. So I would ask the caregiver, like, what is her favorite, what is her favorite food, maybe, and try to bring that, or game, or if she has a favorite TV show, like try to know as much as you can about what makes this person click, and try to connect with her that way, as much as you can. That's a good first start. And if you need any further assistance, you can also feel free to call our helpline, because I have a colleague who has some good tips on this as well. That's actually who I got. So, but feel free to use this as a resource. I also want to mention that at Care and Kind, I neglected to mention this, but we also do provide a training to home health aides who are interested in learning more about dementia. So also, please feel free to contact our helpline, and we can connect you with a trainer and with the training. Let's see, Holocaust survivor and their children have trouble trusting doctors, social worker, aides, and anyone who is not family because they were betrayed during the Holocaust period. That is true. Some of the worst betrayals came at the hands of highly educated people, including physicians. This lack of trust may remain throughout life and be transmitted to the next generation. Thus, the innate hesitation to reach out to strangers for support, even after decades of living in America. That is very true. It's very, very true. It is a dynamic that we have to really keep in mind, that there is a very strong lack of trust in institutions and really anybody out of family. I might even argue some people have been betrayed by people in their family. So it's definitely, but I think at the same time, it's important to, I'm a big fan of planting seeds. And so, like, they may not be ready to get help, but I do think it's important to offer and, keep offering, but not in a heavy-handed way, but you want to offer until, that person might have an openness. They may never have an openness, but, it's important to know that it's there for their taking when they're ready. Will the recording to anyone be emailed to everyone? I will make sure that I will ask to get the recording sent to everybody. I believe it will. Let's see. This is true too. Home health aides should be directed about the Holocaust. Should be educated about the Holocaust, understanding that history is important. Absolutely. So does anybody if anybody wants to ask questions, I'm happy to open the floor or talk, comment. We have some very great insights. Oh, Michael, sorry about that.
It's okay. So this is a fear, and I haven't substantiated it in any way, and I want to hear if you, I hope cannot, but maybe I fear can, which is that because we very, very, I think rightly, as a Jewish community and maybe as a extended community, have focused so much on attention on Holocaust survivors for their stories, which were so necessary for them to tell, for for catharsis, and also for us to have as legacy, especially now. I worry about the folks who are not able anymore to tell a story, and that some of the people who might support them as volunteers, as funding Holocaust-centered organizations, direct service organizations, might forget about the people who no longer are have coherent stories to tell. Have you, I hope you cannot substantiate that from your experience with folks out there, but.
Well, I have to be honest, I'm not familiar with those organizations and how they work.
Mm-hmm.
I am somewhat familiar with I think actually, interestingly enough, in the overall Jewish organizational world, I don't find a lot of attention. The attention that I find that comes with aging is actually from the Holocaust survivor programs.
Yeah. Okay.
Over any of the other ones. I don't know how they are addressing dementia directly. I'm not sure that they do. I mean, I know they're very trauma informed, which is really wonderful. I have trained with some programs or trained some programs, provided some guidance to some programs who needed to know more about the dementia pieces. But yeah, I don't know. And I honestly, I'm not even sure whether you should and engage with the traumatic content in that way with somebody who might not be able to hold on to the resources to keep it contained. That's I guess another piece to it. But it's a good question. Any other questions or comments? Wait, I hear somebody. Oh, Abigail.
Hi there.
Hi.
Thank you for giving the seminar. I'm in a kind of unusual situation. I'm the spouse of a Holocaust survivor. I'm a bit younger than he is. Mm-hmm. He is 80, I'm 64. He was between 2 and 4 years old, but he has a lot of memories from it, not from the camps, but from hiding. And he learned to hate Jews after the war in Slovakia, and then found out he was one when they moved to New York. So he kind of had an identity trauma from it. He has 2 adult children and 12 grandchildren. The adult children they're not my children. Their mother passed away a while back. So I'm his 4th wife, to be honest, but I'm the final one, the one who has been with him for 18 years now. And they are both ultra-Orthodox. They're both, Hasidim. One of them's in Israel, one of them's in Baltimore. And I want to he is currently in a nursing home because he became dangerous at home. He attacked me and he attacked our homeaides. And we just felt like we didn't have control over his physicality, but so much anymore, and nighttime wanderings, and I couldn't sleep and I couldn't work, and those kinds of things. They want him to they really want him to they want to bring him home. They really are not for him being in a nursing home, and they're trying to accept it, but I know that they don't, and I can see that. I mean, I think it's out of religious belief, but I also think it's that filial piety feeling. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that is such a part of their lives right now. And, the interesting thing is, I don't know if this has any bearing on anything, but I myself am not Jewish. And so they had some time accepting me into the family. And then when they saw how happy their father was with me, they finally did accept it. So I want to know who we can talk to about the situation now. How would I, with them together, find a way so that we all feel like their father is being taken care of in the best way possible.
Mm-hmm. they can certainly call. I mean, if you want to talk to me further, we can certainly do that. I guess what I'm wondering is, do they have any specific concerns about the nursing home, or is it just sort of this general, we can't put our father in a nursing home kind of thing?
It's a little, right now it's become a bit of both, because they have seen him there now, and they've seen what he's like at this point, and how he's, let's say, deteriorating. He's a musician, so as long as we have like a keyboard in there and stuff like that, I mean, we're both musicians. But I think part of that wanting to, the son was even saying, I'll take him to Baltimore and I'll have him at home there. He's been talking to social workers about that, and one social worker at the nursing home that he lives in now was actually saying maybe that is better for him. And I am so up in arms about that. I really don't think it is. I think I think that would really. So that's where we're at. We're at this.
I see.
Maybe it's the nursing home itself a little bit. They just, it's the COVID crisis too. At this moment, they shut the visitors down, and then when I came back, he was worse, like everybody else was.
Yeah.
Without anybody being able to come visit, it was just horrifying for the workers as well as the the patients. They're doing the best they can, I get the feeling, but I also feel like, of course, they're understaffed. I don't know if there are any nursing homes that could be better.
It's hard.
He was aggressive, but he's a little better now. He's just agitated at night. He wanders. He goes into, I'm not sure they can handle him, but they say that they can. So,
I think it's going to be a larger conversation. And I think, let's connect afterwards, because,
I would like that.
I think there's a lot of things to kind of weigh out, and, I can talk to you. They're more than welcome to talk to me. And so I think that would be best. So
Okay.
So let's be in touch.
Thank you.
I can actually, I'll put my phone number in the chat. If anybody wants to, has other questions, feel free, you can definitely contact me. And, oh, wait, whoops, I did that wrong. 986, and you can email me. Yes. Oh, and okay. Yes, Miriam.
I just wrote it in the chat, but I'm going to close and I'm going to show my face. Yes, I work for MJHS Hospice and Palliative Care. We have a lot of Holocaust survivors who are also, unfortunately, demented. And we find that musical interventions can be very soothing for all dementia patients, but especially those who are dealing with trauma, whether it's consciously lived or unconsciously because of their dementia, get transported back to a place in history where they were safe, where there is traditional comfort. And we find it really soothes them and supports them and takes away some of the anxiety and the being locked in with the harsh memories. So I just wanted to bring that up, that traditional music, liturgical music can really can work soothingly, almost like a lullaby for people who are demented and who have been traumatized.
Thank you. Yes, that's a very good point. Music is wonderful. If anybody has the movie is, there was a great movie. It was a documentary. It's called Alive Inside. No, it was on Amazon Prime for a while, and it's a documentary based on a program. I'm not sure if they're even around anymore, but it's called Music in Memory, where they would take little iPods and fill it up with, whatever that person liked, whatever music that person liked, particularly in their youth. And it's amazing to see the transformation, both with reducing agitation And also even with being able to have a conversation, like they literally show you where it almost like sparks people's ability to think. So yeah, thank you very much for that.
What was the name of that again?
It's called Alive Inside.
Thank you.
Really, really great program. I know on YouTube they have the trailer for it, but I think the full movie is on Amazon. Anybody else? Any questions or comments? If not, I really want to thank everybody for coming. This is really wonderful, and
Thank you.
for taking your time being here. And
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adina.
Thank you. All righty, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adina.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Thank you.